Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. Last night, the government announced how it will respond to the Supreme Court's cancellation of 214 coal blocks. At the same time, the government has also announced its intention to permit commercial mining at an unspecified date sometime in the future. Does this amount to effective reform or just a small step in the right direction? That's the discussion in part 2. But first, there's a big debate whether elections in Kashmir should be postponed because they could hamper relief and rehabilitation that is vital for tens of thousands who've lost practically everything they have. The ruling National Conference has called for a postponement, but many others like the PDP, BJP and Congress want elections on time. So tonight we ask, is there a legitimate case for postponement, or should the democratic compulsions of the Constitution take precedence over everything else? That's the first debate tonight. And now joining me to discuss whether elections in Kashmir should be held on time is a senior leader of the National Conference, Mirza Mehboob Beg, the spokesperson of the People's Democratic Party, Samir Kaul, former Chief Election Commissioner T.S. Krishnamurthy, and a senior fellow of Shivnadar University and former editor of the Hindu newspaper, Siddharth Vardarajan. Mirza Mehboob Beg, let's start with a simple question. Your party believes that elections, which are due in Jammu and Kashmir in December, should be postponed. Otherwise, they will hamper the relief and rehabilitation work that's underway. What's your basis for saying this?
Karan, not only that, even I'm grateful to you, I must thank you because you stood with us in the misery. They call it the flood of the century which we faced, and it, as you said, it touched everything. It absolutely devastated everything. Forget about even party lines. Question is people of Jammu and Kashmir, and in Kashmir in particular, because floods hit Kashmir Valley in particular. People are still mourning. They haven't come out of the grief and the misery. I know the constitutional requirement, but I think right now it will be not only unfair, it will be inhuman, it will be insensitive, people of Jammu and Kashmir and in Kashmir in particular.
Okay.
And then it will strengthen separatist hands. They will say, come on, you are in grief, you are in misery, you haven't come out of the worst ever floods that has hit you, and here you are, they are asking for votes.
Samir Kaul, on the other hand,
therefore,
I take your point, Mr. Beg. You believe that this is something that should be done both because people are still suffering, rehabilitation is important, and also it will send the wrong message, it will encourage separatists. Let me bring in Samir Kaul. On the other hand, Mr. Kaul, your party, the People's Democratic Party, wants elections on time. How do you respond to the concern expressed by Mehboob Beg? And let me put it like this, that once elections are announced, politicians will concentrate on campaigning, not rehabilitation. The administration will have to concentrate on arranging the polls and not rehabilitation. And as far as both parties are concerned, this will detract from the time and energy they have for rehabilitation. How do you respond to that concern?
Well, I don't share your thoughts in that regard, Mr. Thapar. I personally feel that Kashmir has been through floods, but it has a redoubtable spirit which it has struck back. The youth of our state have all gotten together and got us out of the main miseries. They were our main bulwark against the floods, by the way. They withstood it and they provided immediate rescue and rehabilitation in the state, and these youth today deserve something more than just lip service or emotional outlay. What they deserve is a new life. They want a clean break from the past. They want Naya Kashmir to be built, which is corruption free, which has got a good governance, which is fair, which is judicious, which has got all administration and properly working.
Can I interrupt?
And therefore,
can I interrupt? Are you saying that this takes precedence?
Turn the page of that book.
Are you saying that this takes precedence over the concerns Mirza Mehboob Beg was expressing a moment ago? Give me a pointed answer to that.
I think he has concerns. And I would assume that they are well placed. But at the same time, if you do recall, that the election commissioner went down there with all his people, and what the reports he got back from everybody, which includes the administration, the revenue officials, the police department, almost every part which is involved in carrying forth elections in that state, have reported that they are amply able, staffed and able to carry on both relief work and the political process.
Mr. Kaur, I'm going to stop you there because actually we have a former chief election commissioner. Let the former chief election commissioner. No, I'm going to stop you. Let the former chief election commissioner who's with us speak on behalf of the election commission if he wishes to. Let me put that to you, Mr. Krishnamurthy. You have been chief election commissioner. You know how onerous is the task of organizing an election in Kashmir in December. Can the administration do this? And I'm pointedly leaving politicians out. Can the administration do this without diminishing its efforts for rehabilitation and relief?
Yeah. The most important requirement for conducting elections is an updated electoral roll and the security for the voters as well as the voting stations. If these are substantially fulfilled, and if there is no violence anticipated at least as much as possible, or if there is any adequate arrangement to prevent violence, I think we should go ahead with the elections. But as far as the date is concerned, the assembly is due, it ends its term on 19th January. And so the election commission has to weigh the various conditions prevalent there. I believe the deputy election commissioner has visited and the voter roll is being updated. If these conditions are complied with, there should not be any reason for delaying the election by one day.
Can I put this to you?
The primary requirement is the updated voter roll, the security consideration.
I understand the point you're making. I want to put a slightly different issue to you. Can the actual conduct of the elections, the physical conduct of polls, banning the polls, making sure the voting happens and all of that, can that happen without detracting from the necessary effort for rehabilitation?
Well, if the relief work is still pending, if the
Carry on, finish your answer.
If the relief work is still pending and it is interfering with the election process, we have to take that into account in fixing the dates for the elections.
But this is very interesting. Now you're saying you have to take that into account in fixing a date for the election. So that could then be an argument for postponing the election somewhat.
Now we had a similar situation in Gujarat in 2002. We did consider a slight delay, not substantial delay, a slight delay, and delayed the elections. But what is, as I told you, what is important is the voter secure enough to come and exercise his vote?
No, but I'm moving beyond that, Mr. Krishnamurthy. I'm moving beyond that. I'm moving beyond the completion of the electoral rolls and security of the vote. I'm out talking about whether it affects rehabilitation. And as you said, in Gujarat, for the very similar sort of reasons after the Bhuj earthquake, you agreed to delay the election somewhat. The same argument could apply in Kashmir. That has to be the logical conclusion. Am I right?
No, that's what I said. The issue is the relief work going to hamper the election process? This is an issue which has to be decided by the commission after personally visiting the place.
Absolutely. Let me bring you in, Siddharth Varadarajan. We've got a very clear answer from Mr. Krishnamurthy, the former Chief Election Commissioner. The commission has to decide whether holding elections will hamper and hold up the relief work. If it does, then you can delay it. Now, I want to put a slightly different question to you. In your eyes, in a democracy, what should have greater priority at this time? Holding elections so that the constitutional commitments and compulsions are complete and there is no delay in the new assembly coming into being, or ensuring speedy relief and rehabilitation for tens of thousands who've not only suffered badly, but may have lost practically everything they have? Which is a greater priority in a democracy at this time?
Karan, I think it's absolutely absurd for somebody to make a fetish out of holding elections by a particular date, as if that is the most important constituent element in governance or democracy. The priority has to be rehabilitation. There cannot be two questions about it. There should not be any debate about this. And if you factor in the historic tendency to have a low turnout in those regions which have been affected by the flood, to my mind, it's also politically very disastrous to leave the task of rehabilitation unfinished and rush headlong into elections in order to fulfill what is, after all, a requirement that can easily be postponed, because you have a provision under the J&K and the Indian Constitution to have governor's rule. So the fear that a delay in elections will somehow give an advantage to the ruling NC Congress arrangement, or will disadvantage other parties, is unfounded. I think that, by all accounts, some headway has been made in relief and rehabilitation, but if you consider the enormity of the problems, the economic losses that have only now slowly, by calculating them and beginning to address them.
Okay.
Loss of livelihood. I think all of this requires, activity by the government at the central and state level on a war footing, and I can't imagine why anybody would want to detract from that important task by saying that elections have to be held in time for the assembly to be reconvened on the 20th of January.
Let me put that point to Samir Kaur. Samir Kaur, you've heard the former Chief Election Commissioner saying that, in fact, for very similar reasons, in the time of the Gujarat elections of 2002, just after the Bhuj earthquake, those elections were delayed to ensure that there was no hold-up of relief and rehabilitation. You've heard the argument made by Siddharth Vardarajan. How do you respond to that? Because both of them are giving you cogent reasons why priority of relief should take precedence.
I've heard both, and I think they're both right in what they're saying. But I have a question for you, Karan. Why are you presenting as this or that? Why can't it be both? Are we so downtrodden today in our present setup that we cannot run a rehabilitation process and an election at the same time? Is this a signature of our inefficiency? Why are we thinking about it? Why can't both be done? And particularly when the people involved are clearly enunciating and they are assuring you that both processes can ably be conducted at the same time.
This is not a polemical point between you and me. This is an analytical discussion. Let me put this to you.
Of course.
Ideally, both things should be able to happen effectively together, holding of a poll and relief. But if both can't, because the devastation is so severe, because the very same people who have to do the rehabilitation will then get involved in the holding of elections. If therefore one has to be given priority, shouldn't the priority be given to relief rather than holding elections?
If you look at the drawing, Karan, if you look at the drawing board more wholesomely, you'll realize that about 11 out of 87, 11 constituencies are directly or indirectly affected by the floods. Yes, they've hit us hard, because they've hit us at the central district in Srinagar, where all the commercial establishments are. But if you look at the drawing board as a whole of the Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh state, it's quite a varied landscape, and you will realize that out of 87, there are only 11 constituencies which are affected by the floods. So are you trying to tell me in today's day and age, with the kind of infrastructure we have, we can't run both processes at the same time?
Let me put that point to Mr. Krishnamurti. Let me put that point to Mr. Samir Kaur, hold your peace. Let me put that point to Mr. Krishnamurti. It's a good point you make. Mr. Krishnamurti, what he's saying is that, according to him, only 11 areas have been devastated. The rest of the valley, the rest of the state is actually not that badly affected. How much concern do you think the Election Commission will give to 11 districts or 11 areas being devastated, and how heavily will that weigh in their mind when they decide whether they should delay it or go ahead with the elections? From your experience as a former CEC, answer that.
If it is only a particular section of the state which is affected and which needs to be given time, the election can be so phased that the last phase can be the last in the area where it has been affected. But this is a judgment only the Election Commission can take after visiting the place. You cannot give a categorical answer straight away now that you can have the election and postpone this part of the region for elections. These are issues which we personally to be visited and decided.
Can I put something else to you?
Yes.
Can I put something else to you, sir?
The regions affected can be deferred.
Can I put something else to you? Is this decision to be taken simply on the basis of what the majority of the political parties tell you? In other words, will the majority of the political parties determine the decision, or will the Election Commission take into account the argument, and it is only an argument, that the first priority should be rehabilitation, as was the case in Bhuj. The second priority after rehabilitation is election. So is this a decision taken by what the majority of parties say, or on normative concerns?
No, the majority does not have any factor in this. The views of various parties are taken into account. We don't go by the majority views of the political parties. We assess the situation on the ground and take a decision. But the fact that there are majority of political parties taking one view and one set of minority of political parties is taking the other view do not really affect the final decision.
Okay. Mr. Beg, let me put to you a concern, or maybe I should call it a suspicion, that people have with your party's demand that in fact the elections should be postponed. They say you're really only doing this because you know that if elections are held on time, you'll be decimated. A 6-month delay gives you a small window to try and perhaps rehabilitate yourself as much as the state. Not that you're going to perhaps get many more seats with a 6-month delay, but at least it gives you an opportunity to hope to perform better. So is it actually public interest that is at the front of your mind, or self-interest?
No, Karan, that's what I said when I began. I said and I repeated that I was not only saying on behalf of my party. I was saying I was talking to you and speaking from the bottom of my heart. This is the feeling. If you will feel this is the feeling. You are not talking about a constituency. You see, even in South Kashmir, yes, capital Srinagar has been devastated, the commercial hub. No doubt about it. If you go to South Kashmir, Karan, entire orchards along with fruit trees, full apple trees,
but
they have been washed away.
The point I put
Paddy fields have been washed away.
But Mr. Beg, I don't deny that devastation is enormous. I'm asking, are you using the devastation actually for a personal party gain? Because your party will benefit from the delay. Your party would be devastated if elections are held on time.
I don't. Let me tell you very honestly, I don't think that it's going to make any difference so far as that is concerned, because 6 years is a long period for the people to judge whether this government has performed or it hasn't performed. I don't think by postponing or pushing elections by a couple of months will make any difference so far as that thing is concerned. I don't think it will make any difference.
You may be right, you may well be right. Cynics will say that in fact, whether you hold the elections today or 6 months later, your party will be devastated either way. So you may well be right. Siddharth Varadarajan, on the other hand, the opposite view to yours is the point made by Sameer Kaur, that a new election will give a new mandate to a government which hereafter will be far more vigorous in rehabilitation and relief, and therefore far more effective than either the present government, which is very much in its last lap, or governor's rule. And that maybe what Kashmir needs is that new mandate which gives and creates the opportunity for reinvigorated rehabilitation. How do you respond to that?
No, I think Sameer's point is excellent. It's true. But rehabilitation there's a short-term immediate component, and then there's a medium and long-term aspect. For the short term, I think that's all that we're talking about. That is are you able to turn the corner and allow people to lead at least a semblance of normality, so that voting, which has anyway not been a very high priority in these areas, becomes something that they want to do. That has to be the immediate political goal. Now, for the medium term and long term, given the extent of devastation, there will be plenty of time for the new government to prove its credentials, and we hope do much better than previous governments have done.
Okay.
So I don't think that as such is the problem. The issue is simply this, that if the elections are held at a time when people are simply not going to turn out to vote, even more than they have been, even less than they've been inclined to do in the past, what's the value of this kind of election? And I think, in the past, the Indian state has made a fetish out of elections where people haven't turned up to vote. What was important about the last assembly election was the relatively high turnout, not uniformly across the state. Northern Kashmir, Ladakh, Jammu did much better than the southern and central parts. But I think every effort should be made to get a proper turnout. And if that means delaying by a couple of months, not 6 months, a couple of months, so be it. I don't think the Election Commission should turn its... they should consider this as a possibility.
Well, you got a hint from Mr. Krishnamurthy that could be something the Election Commission considers, simply because it set a precedent at the time of the 2002 polls when there was a slight delay in Gujarat. Sameer Kaur, before I go back to Mr. Krishnamurthy, let me put to you a question very similar to the one I put a moment ago to Mirza Mehboob Beg. It could be said that the reason why your party is pushing for immediate elections is because you're going to gain. the anti-incumbency Mirza Beg's party faces will translate into votes for you. A 6-month delay could actually damage that from your point of view. You don't want a 6-month delay. It's in your interest to have immediate elections and cash in on the anti-incumbency against his party. Isn't that one reason why you're pushing for polls immediately?
Let's be very clear, Karan.
Mr. Krishnamurti, that's actually for Samir Kaul. I'll come back to you in a moment's time. Go ahead, Samir Kaul, answer that.
Okay. If I today were able to wish the floods away, that they hadn't happened, and the devastation that they brought along with it, let's just suppose they didn't happen. This government was going to go anyway, Karan, because the kind of governance, the governance was at its lowest ebb, abhorrent regime
you're not
that
answering
existed.
my question. My question is, you're pushing for this out of self-interest.
The problem.
You're pushing for this out of self-interest rather than democratic principle.
It was time for a change of government. Of course, all I'm saying is that you look at it wholesomely, you look at it methodically, and the Election Commission, let it take a very informed view.
Okay.
And there is nothing called as majority political view here, Karan. Political parties generally are
You're not answering my question, Samir Kaul. Focus on my question. I asked you a pointed question that the reason why you're insisting on elections is because you'll gain from immediate elections. You don't want a postponement because that might change the mood and atmosphere from which you benefit. Answer that pointedly.
All I'm saying is that is probably one of the reasons, but not the only one.
You conceded. Thank you very much.
I'm being frank and honest here.
I applaud that.
Yes, I'm telling you, even if the floods wouldn't have been there, this government was going anyways and we were in.
I applaud that. Honesty is a quality I greatly admire from politicians. And seeking advantage for your party is not a crime.
People want a change.
Okay. Mr. Krishnamurti, let me bring you in and put this to you. This is clearly an issue.
Let me be honest.
Let me bring in Mr. Krishnamurti. I applaud your honesty, Mr. Kaul. I think it's a wonderful quality in a politician. Mr. Krishnamurti, this is clearly an issue of considerable importance, but it hasn't got the attention in the media that I think it deserves. As a former election commissioner, are you dismayed by that, by the absence of debate? Because that seems to suggest this is a peripheral rather than a key issue.
Well, you see, Election Commission is a political institution, and as far as the views of the political parties are concerned, they are certainly taken into account. Whether the new government will do a better job or the old government is not doing a better job is not a relevant consideration as far as fixing the election dates are concerned. As I told you, there are a few important criteria which should be fulfilled. If these criteria are fulfilled, the Election Commission will decide on the dates. But the issue is whether the new government will do a better job of the relief work is not at all a relevant consideration. If necessary, there can be a precedence rule. That is not the point. But the Election Commission's focus of attention will be only on the conditions, ground conditions for conducting the elections administratively as well as security-wise.
One other question, Mr. Krishnamurti. You spoke about the possibility of the elections being delayed or postponed a bit, not necessarily all of 6 months. Now, they're due in December. If you postpone them to, say, February, you do it bang in the middle of the worst snow and the worst weather conditions in Kashmir. So if you're going to postpone in Kashmir, doesn't it mean you have to postpone by at least 3 or 4 months? 2 months is an impractical thing to do.
I agree with you.
I lost you after you said I agree with you. Do you want to finish your sentence, Mr. Krishnamurti?
I agree with you that weather conditions is also a very important criterion for deciding the dates, because the voters should be in a position to come out and exercise their vote with free will. So this will be taken into account, whether the delay, if it is going to be too long, whether it is desirable, or whether there should be a precedence rule in between, so that the elections can produce, the conducive conditions will be there to conduct the elections at a later date.
Okay.
These are issues which will be decided. I am sure the Election Commission will take these aspects into account before announcing the dates.
Very quickly, Siddharth Bharadarajan, because we're horribly out of time for this particular story. Are you dismayed that this issue hasn't got the attention it deserves in the media, that it isn't being debated and discussed more vigorously, so that public opinion is being generated one way or the other, not necessarily on any one side, but across the spectrum? A quick answer.
Yeah, no, Yeah, I am dismayed. In fact, not just the question of the election timing, but I think the whole extent of the devastation and the progress of the relief work has gone off the radar nationally. I think that's unfortunate. I think we need to have more attention focused on this.
All right, my thanks to all four of my guests for joining me. This is an issue that is clearly going to be decided one way or another fairly soon, because if the elections are going to happen, they need to be announced soon, and if they're going to be postponed, then that decision too needs to be taken. My thanks to all four of my guests for joining me. Time for a break, but then, how far-reaching was the coal sector announcement by the government last night? Does it amount to real reform or just an expression of intent? Join me in a moment to find out.